The role of a Paralympic classifier has two main components. So first of all, we invite the athlete and their coach in, and we do a series of tests. Some of them are based on the computer and some are tabletop tests. And in those tests, we're looking at things like processing speed and memory, for example. And then after that, there'll be a sports-specific test. So recently, for example, I was classifying swimmers for a sporting event, and that involved operating a video analysis of the swimmers in competition and observing the swimmers during competition. And then at the end of the day, we combine all of the results. And then if the athlete meets classification criteria, then we can confirm that they're able to compete in that event. I think my background in psychology has been helpful in a number of ways in my role as a classifier. For example, in the computer-based and tabletop testing, there's a need to be very methodical with that and do things in a certain way. And as psychologists, we have a background in psychometric testing, and it's really important that those are standardised in order that the results are reliable. So that's been helpful. Also, the testing process itself can be quite a nerve-wracking one for athletes and their coaches, because they know that depending on the outcome of classification, they might or might not be able to compete in the events that they've worked so hard, in training for. And so when we're communicating with people, it's really important that we can help to put them at ease and build a rapport so that we can get the best out of them ultimately. And another thing that I would say is that as a psychologist, I'm used to working in situations that can be stressful and high pressured. And that's also true at times of the competition environment. So to be able to stay calm and focused on what you're doing in the face of whatever's going on is really important. I think having been involved in classification, it's really made me think more broadly about psychology and notice the risk at times that it can become overly problem focused, and inevitably people are referred to us because there is a problem of some kind that needs attention. But I think sometimes that somebody's wider strengths and successes and interests can be lost sight of a little bit, and being involved with athletes they're elite athletes, they're at the top of their game and they've been training incredibly hard to get to where they've got to. I think it serves as a real reminder that despite the fact that somebody may have an intellectual disability, that in another area that they really excel. And for me, that's been fantastic to see. And not only is it about an individual recognising another individual as having a strength, say within a psychology session, but in the case of these athletes, it's the fact that being involved in these events means they're recognised by their friends, their family, society more generally, and by other people with intellectual disabilities who could then perhaps aspire themselves to really achieve something, despite the fact they have limitations in other areas. Well, one of the interesting things about working as a classifier is that you meet people from different backgrounds to your own. So typically when you're classifying, you work in pairs, and usually that comprises of a psychologist and also somebody from a sports background who may have been an athlete themselves or previously worked in coaching other athletes. And so that combination of skills is both interesting for each other, because you learn a lot from each other's experience, but also in terms of the classification process, it means that having that dual expertise means that the classification process is one that's thorough and informed by two sets of backgrounds. I think on the one hand, there are some challenges to the role of being a classifier. It can feel like quite a weighty responsibility at times, because the process of classification means that somebody may or may not, in fact, be able to compete. And all these athletes have been training for years, and it's a huge part of their lives. And to know that ultimately they may not be able to compete because they're not, they don't meet the criteria. That can feel like quite a heavy responsibility. But on the other hand, I think the bonuses, if you like, to being involved far outweigh that. And often you get to travel around as a classifier, you get to meet people from all over the world, both in terms of other classifiers, athletes, their coaches. So there's a real richness to the work. And seeing somebody, or the athletes that have intellectual disabilities, sort of overcome so many odds in some ways. You know, they do have disadvantages in terms of learning and using strategy and things like that, which are required for sport. But to see that they've overcome that and achieved not just quite well, but to the level where they're really excelling, I think is an amazing thing. And because the classification process has the 2 stages, you do get to know the athletes a little bit, and so you meet them first of all in the computer-based and tabletop testing, and then you'll observe them in competition in a whole other capacity, and they're getting ready to compete and psyching themselves up, and then actually watching them race or whatever the event is. That's incredibly exciting, and you can't help but feel very, you know, moved by the whole experience, really. And to know that by being a classifier, people are given the opportunity to compete in a way that they haven't since the Sydney Olympic Games, and that for all these years people haven't been able to get the recognition that they deserve after all the hard work. So I think that's really fantastic that through this process they now can. So that's very exciting.